Hello and welcome back to microbiology. In chapter 11 we're talking about physical and chemical control of microbes. Really, this is how we kill microbes. One thing to note here is that we're going to have a large portion at the end that is not really going to be testable. So once we get to all the different chemicals, I'll give you a little bit of info on them, but again, I'm not going to test you on those. So I'll make sure and make that obvious and clear that from that point on, again, not testable. So we've been able to control microbial growth for a long time. Many historical methods include using things that created different osmotic pressures, so like salting foods or smoking foods or drying foods. All those created situations where we typically won't have the right environment for growth, right? So if we're in a hypertonic situation, cells can't grow. Doing things like pickling is really about basically using differences in pH and then exposing stuff to sunlight. Was again this illustration that UV light can kill cells. So really there's a lot of terms in this chapter, so naturally any bold term you should definitely know, but at this point several of these things we've kind of talked about. So like sterilization, you should know, is the destruction of all microbial life. But we haven't really discussed much on disinfection or antisepsis or decontamination. These are very different. With disinfection, we're going to destroy most microbial life, reducing the contamination on inanimate surfaces. So you disinfect non-living things, like your table. Antisepsis, on the other hand, is known as degerming, which is just like disinfection, but now on living tissues. So you do antisepsis or degerming of a wound. Decontamination is also known as sanitization, and what decontamination is the removal of most microbes on an inanimate or animate thing, thus decreasing the risk of transmission. So to summarize again, sterilization is removal of all life, disinfection is removal of most life on inanimate things, antisepsis is removal of most life on living surfaces, and then decontamination is just bringing things down to a safe level. So whenever we look at the kind of setup of what we're going to do, notice there's really three categories of microbial control: physical agents, chemical agents, and the mechanical removal methods. Naturally, physical agents include things like your temperatures, your radiation, basically water availability. Whenever we talk about chemical agents, now we're talking about things like gases and liquids, and a lot of these are pretty harsh compounds, and we'll see a little bit of those at the end. And then the last set here is mechanical removal, which is just literally filtration, where we remove the microbe from the environment. So the ultimate goal here is to basically bring microorganisms down below what would be those levels that cause infection or spoilage. Naturally, you should at this point understand that there are always microbes all around us all the time, and so we would need to do this to protect ourselves and our food. One of the other things to note is most of the stuff that lives in nature isn't just one thing. It's going to be a mixture of things, and there are many times where they form biofilms. So whenever we look at things on an individual basis, notice this is basically a image that's illustrating the level of complexity in terms of removing things from the environment. So at the top here, prions. Prions are incredibly hard to remove from the environment. Just under that is the endospore, and Mycobacterium, Staph, and Pseudomonas. And then we start seeing our first protozoa, but specifically the dormant version, the cyst. Then we have our trophozoites. Now we're seeing the majority of bacteria and gram-negative and gram-positive fungal spores and fungi, and then our viruses as well. So really, again, the things that are more difficult are at the top, the easier things to remove at the bottom. We've already talked a little bit about endospores, but it's important to remind you that these are very resistant structures found in Bacillus and Clostridium. And so the idea here is Bacillus and Clostridium, when the environment gets bad, can form endospores that allow them to survive harsh environments. They are not active as endospores, and again, only become active whenever the environment gets better. And so naturally, these things are super hard to remove from the environment. Here's an illustration of how difficult it is to remove them. Notice we have endospores here, but then the vegetative form of the bacteria or the normal active form here. So if we're using heat to kill endospores, it takes 120 degrees Celsius, but it only takes 80 degrees Celsius to kill a normal active bacteria. And so the idea here is if we can kill the endospore, we can totally kill the vegetative bacteria. And as you look through, it's the same pattern. It takes way more radiation to kill the endospore. It takes more sterilizing gas like ethylene oxide to kill the endospore. It takes significantly longer to destroy endospores than it does vegetative bacteria using things like glutaraldehyde. The idea is pretty simple, that whenever it comes to endospores, they are significantly more resistant to death than normal bacteria are. And as a result, if we can kill endospores, we're definitely going to kill everything else. So really our definition of sterility is the point at which we can kill endospores. So naturally, sterilization is that trying to achieve sterility. And as we just illustrated, we need to be able to kill endospores, and then we can kill everything else that's around. And so the idea here is things that pass through what would be our protective mechanisms should be sterile. So like surgical equipment that's going to penetrate the skin. Same with syringes. Commercially packaged food is something that's often sterile, but it's not for the reasons you think. We have systems built in for food and drink in terms of trying to prevent infection, but really they sterilize commercially packaged food so it stays viable longer, so that you will buy it and then consume it. Disinfection, again, is removal of most living things from an inanimate object. Whenever we say most, we're really talking about everything but endospores. And so the idea here is we'll get rid of any vegetative microbes, but the endospores will often remain whenever we disinfect things. Antisepsis, it's the same idea. Again, we'll remove the majority of things, but what would typically remain would be endospores. Whenever we look at the word antisepsis, we should probably break it up and first talk about sepsis. Sepsis is really growth of microorganisms in blood and other tissues. So whenever you hear a patient is septic, they have typically infection of the blood. So the idea is we want to prevent sepsis, so we use asepsis. So it's a practice that prevents the pathogens from causing infection. And so one of the things that we do is aseptic technique. These are sterile methods that exclude all microbes and prevent sepsis. So again, aseptic technique is going to prevent infection. And so antisepsis is an application of chemicals to expose body surfaces, wounds, or surgical incisions to destroy or inhibit vegetative bacteria. So again, we're going to kill most things with antiseptics except for endospores. Whenever we talk about antimicrobial compounds, they really fall into two categories: the sides and the statics. Whenever you see side, you should understand that means to kill. So a bactericide kills bacteria. A fungicide kills fungi. A viricide does not kill viruses, it inactivates them. And a sporicide is capable of destroying spores like endospores. Statics, on the other hand, don't kill, they just really stop any future growth. Again, if you have an infection and you take a static, you're just going to make sure the infection doesn't get worse. So bacteriostatics, fungistatics, microbiostatics, the idea is we stop future growth. Decontamination, again, is not trying to remove everything. We're going to remove a vast majority of things, but we're really trying to reduce numbers to make things safe to interact with. So these are things like soaps and detergents that sanitize. The idea is that we can take and decrease numbers and thus decrease the risk of infection. One of the things that's important to understand about these processes is again, we're trying to decrease numbers. Again, the less things that are around, the less likely we are to get sick from them. So there's a lot of times where mechanical means are tied into these, where we're not just going to put the soap on our hands, we have to physically move the soap around. That scrubbing or mechanical action also does to some degree removal of the pathogens. So understanding that we're doing lots of different things, trying to decrease numbers to make ourselves safe is pretty important. So one of the things I want to point out is that there are some real questions that come up here in terms of what's important for microbial control. So like, does this item in question require sterilization, or is disinfection necessary? And so the idea here is if something's going to penetrate a protective barrier like the skin, it definitely needs to be sterile. The next question is the item to be reused or permanently discarded? Again, if we're going to reuse something, we definitely need to remove all the things, or as much of the things as we possibly can. If it's going to be something discarded, we just have to make it safe to be carried out as waste. Ultimately, again, if we are reusing, can we use heat or pressure or radiation or chemicals on the thing? And so naturally, again, this is a question that comes up, but it's unique to each of the things. Something like, a metal, syringe typically can be sterilized with different techniques like radiation. But if we're talking about actual electronics, radiation probably not great for it, nor is typically moist heat. And so the idea is we have to really try to figure out what's the best option. The next question is the control method suitable for a given application? Again, can we actually, apply that moist heat to an electronic component? The answer is probably no. Again, penetration of the microbial agent is also a concern. So will the agent penetrate to the necessary extent? So we're going to basically remove as much as we possibly can. And then the last question is the method cost and labor efficient? And is it safe? And this is often a major concern because there are things that will kill everything, including spores out there. But those things are typically very dangerous, very expensive, and ultimately maybe not labor efficient. And so again, these are all questions that we're going to work through as we move through. So naturally, whenever we talk about critical medical devices, we're talking about things that are expected to come into contact with tissues that would be sterile typically. And so the idea is we want to make sure that the equipment is sterile. We don't want to introduce bad things into sterile tissues. Semi-critical medical devices would be things that would come into things where microbes may actually be introduced. So like things that go in the gastrointestinal tract. Again, a thermometer would be considered semi-critical. You want to make sure and try to basically remove anything that's there, but you don't have to remove everything because naturally pathogens come in through the gastrointestinal pathway. And then non-critical medical devices are those that don't actually allow for penetration into the body usually. So they're things that touch the body but don't get through into the inside. And so naturally we need less levels of control there. So the idea is the critical things we need sterile technique. Semi-critical we usually do disinfection on, and then the non-critical things we usually just sanitize. So naturally with microbial death, this is pretty self-explanatory at this point. Naturally with microbial death, if we add certain agents, death is more likely to occur. And again, the fewer pathogens there, the less likely we see any issues of infection. There are several things that can affect the death rate of microorganisms, including the number of microorganisms. Naturally, how many microbes are in the population, really the structure of the population and the type of growth that we're seeing, the temperature and pH of the environment, the concentration of the agent used, the mode of action, and even the presence of other things that would neutralize the compound that you're using to destroy the microbes. So there are lots of variables to consider in any designing or planning for what type of technique to remove microbes. So ultimately, one of the questions that we need to ask is, how is this antimicrobial agent going to work? What's it going to target? And so there are several targets that we see, things like the cell wall, the cell or cytoplasmic membrane, cellular synthesis processes like DNA and RNA production, or even proteins and protein production. The idea is the more different our target is from our own cells, the less likely we are to hurt our cells. And so one of the things to consider for safety is, again, if we're targeting a cell wall, will it target even our cell walls? If it's going to target protein synthesis, will it disrupt our protein synthesis? And so those are real questions that has to be asked. So some of the ways that we damage the cell wall is block cell wall synthesis, or we can break down the cell wall that's already there. Or even just damaging the surface is often enough to allow for lysis and then ultimately the death of the cell. Whenever we talk about the cell membrane, it's important to understand that we do put ourselves at risk. But if we do remember that the outermost cells that we have on our skin are dead, it would make a lot more sense how we can use these. But again, these things should only be used on the outer surface like the skin. because what can happen is we lose the selective permeability or lose vital molecules that help the cell function, or even allow for greater entry of damaging chemicals. Surfactants are a great example of this, and ultimately what they're going to do is bind to and disrupt that semi-permeable bilayer that's made of phospholipids. And so it's going to allow for weak spots or leaky spots to form, allowing for chemicals to more readily penetrate. So here's an illustration of this. Again, surfactants are going to straight up cause the membrane to come apart, which naturally means things can readily pass in and out of the cell, which is not good for a cell. So there are also things that affect protein and nucleic acid synthesis. Again, we do have to be cautious with this because we also make proteins and copy genetic material. But there are some unique differences. If you recall, microbes had 70S ribosomes. So if we targeted and destroyed 70S ribosomes, there's less likely of a chance that it hurts us. Naturally, we have our native state versus denatured state for proteins. Again, in a native state, it's the normal three-dimensional structure that allows it to properly function. But we've done denaturation before, and denaturation is causing the unfolding, making the protein or enzyme no longer functional. And we discussed how bad that could very much be for the cell. So one of the things we can do to denature proteins is actually use heat. Heat is great to do this. Moist heat is actually much more effective because it penetrates more readily. So it ultimately causes basically the proteins to unfold and become functionless. Another thing that's commonly used for this is organic acids and phenols. The idea here is these things can disrupt the structure, causing again denaturation. Other things include metallic ions that actually can bind to active sites, preventing them from even doing their job. And so metallic ions often can disrupt enzymes and their function. So let's move on now to methods of physical control. Heat was one of those things that we were just discussing, but we also see other methods like radiation, filtration, sound waves, and even, again, cold. With heat, there are two different types of heat that we're going to be interested in: moist heat and dry heat. Moist heat is actually very effective. Moist heat is allowed to penetrate more effectively in the cell, causing again a basically denaturation of the internal proteins of the cell more rapidly. So you can actually use lower temperatures of moist heat and still achieve the same level of killing. Dry heat, on the other hand, is typically going to have higher temperatures because we're going to have to try to cook from the outside to the inside. And so the general idea is it takes much more heat to cause death with dry heat than moist heat. And here's that exact illustration. Notice with moist heat we can kill everything at 121 degrees Celsius in 15 minutes. But with dry heat at 121 degrees Celsius, the time increases significantly, up to 600 minutes. If you don't know, that's 10 hours. And so the idea here is moist heat is far more effective. We can kill things in 15 minutes versus dry heat that would be 10 hours. But what I really care more about is that you understand temperature and time will be inversely related. As one goes up, the other goes down. And that doesn't matter whether it's moist heat or dry heat. As we increase temperature, time required goes down. And so again, if we have more time, we could always lower the temperature. So again, these two ideas are again opposing ideas. So this is an inverse relation. There are things that will be more resistant to temperature changes, including endospores. Again, endospores are going to be the resistant features in bacteria. And so naturally, again, we would have a temperature that would kill an endospore, but that same temperature would kill all the vegetative cells as well. So whenever we talked about time and temperature, again, they were inversely related. So if we wanted to figure out what the thermal death time is, we would have to hold temperature static. Or if we want to know the thermal death point, we'd have to hold the time static. And so the idea here is to learn one, you must define the other. So here's illustrations of the different techniques, including, your moist heat applications like boiling water, pasteurization. There's even our steam sterilization, which is what the autoclave is. Here's a picture of the autoclave. Again, how it works is we're going to have temperature, moisture, but also pressure. By applying pressure, we can push that moist heat into the cell more effectively, creating more death. But dry heat also works. But again, typically higher temperatures are required. As a general rule, though, fire kills anything. So if ever in doubt, light it on fire. Cold is going to be a little different from heat because heat will actually, again, denature. Cold is merely going to slow activities or slow growth. There are things that will die from cold temperatures, typically if you hold cold long enough. But generally, if you take and do a gradual cooling that then leads to ultimately freezing, that cell is likely to survive that type. One of the other things we can do is desiccation or dehydration of a vegetative cell. Again, this typically wouldn't immediately kill the cell, but if we leave the cell dry enough or long enough, it will die. One of the cool things we can do is what's basically freeze drying, where we'll dry a cell and then freeze it. This is called lyophilization. The idea here is that by lowering the amount of water and then freezing the cell, we put the cell in kind of a perpetual dormant state that won't allow for cell growth until the cell is warmed up and rehydrated. So if we want to store bacterial cells for a long time, we often lyophilize the cells. Radiation is another one of those things that's going to be able to kill cells, but it's really light with shorter wavelengths than visible light. So UV, X-rays, gamma rays, these things can damage DNA and kill cells. The idea, though, is the shorter the wavelength, the more quickly and effectively we kill cells. So things like UV work, but it takes pretty good long time of exposure, while gamma rays, on the other hand, you would typically have pretty quick death. Irradiation is basically going to be the bombardment of microbes with radiation. So to irradiate something, it means you're going to hit it with radiation. There's really ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, basically radiation that ejects orbital electrons from an atom, causing ions to form, and naturally this causes damage to proteins, while the non-ionizing radiation will typically disrupt genetic features like DNA. So you can see here with the ionizing radiation, we can again still have damage to the DNA, like the breakage of DNA. But what happens in the non-ionizing is we'll often have a scenario where we have disruption and basically base pair matching. Either way, radiation is a very effective way to kill cells. Ionizing radiation or cold sterilization methods are commonly used in food products. Many people don't realize it, but a lot of your food is irradiated that you consume. But since it really damages DNA, it doesn't really hurt us in any way, because what are you going to do with that DNA found in the chicken that you eat? Well, you're going to break it down for energy anyway, so who cares if the T's were stuck together? There are several different radiation methods. Again, the use of gamma rays and X-rays would be ionizing versions, while non-ionizing is things like UV radiation. UV, again, is lethal in wavelengths between 240 and 280 nanometers. So we typically see germicidal lamps that literally produce in that range around 254. That allows for, again, death of microbes. This typically works really well on things like liquids and gases, but not so much on solids. If we use it on solids, it would really just be to disinfect the surface. And ultimately, again, we're not going to get that penetration that we would see with even our ionizing radiation. So what does the UV do to genetic material? Well, if you notice in this image, usually the T's on one strand would be stuck to A's on the other. But notice whenever we hit the DNA with UV radiation, the T's disassociate from the other strand and stick to one another. And so this isn't that bad until we try to copy the DNA, because what pairs with two T's stuck together? I don't know, and neither does the cell, and so that results in a mutational error. Another technique that we'll talk about is physical methods like decontamination by filtration. The idea is that we've removed the microbe from the environment, making now that environment sterile. So whenever we talk about filters, we filter air and we filter liquids. And so this is an illustration of filtering liquids. Notice again, microbes can occupy that upper layer, But as the liquids pull through the filter, and which is usually a membrane, by the way, notice the bacteria is too big to fit through the holes or pores, and as a result, the liquid on the other side should be sterile and free of microbial life. So there are different size holes for different filters, and so the idea is a coarse filter that's around 8 microns in terms of the size of the pore or hole wouldn't really filter out bacteria, because again the average bacteria is 1 micron. An ultrafine, on the other hand, 0.02, would filter out many viruses that exist. And so the idea is different filters have different levels of filtration. In general, a 1 micron or smaller would be something you would use to filter out bacteria. So what can we use these for? Again, typically liquids and gases. And these are things that usually don't do well with heat. And so you would want to use filtration to remove the microbes instead of using heat. So helpful in things like water purification, decontamination of milk and beer, even removing airborne contaminants in many heating and cooling systems nowadays. Osmotic pressure is another way that we can effectively kill cells. Again, if we create a hypertonic situation by having excessive amounts of solutes like salts or sugars, we can see again the microbes would dump their resources like water to dilute the solute. And so the idea here is that this would make it impossible for microbes to reproduce and cause ultimately spoilage of the food. Whenever we talk about chemical agents, we're really talking about things that come in solid, liquid, or gas form. Naturally, solids aren't going to be something you can use effectively, so solids often have to be basically suspended or diluted in liquid. And so really there are 2 solution types we should talk about. Aqueous solutions, which are going to be primarily water as the solvent, and then tinctures. Tinctures are going to be basically alcohol or water alcohol mixtures. So you can look through these. I'm not going to test you much on these. Again, we're not quite to the point where I say don't worry about stuff for tests, but I really won't focus much on this for the test. Again, this is a continuation of that table, so same applies here. Don't stress too much about it. It doesn't hurt to kind of look over these, but again, this won't be a major focus of the test in any way. But really, we do need to figure out what we need quality-wise for a germicidal liquid. Ultimately, we need to figure out how quickly we want to act, how soluble it is, what things is it going to kill, how far does it penetrate, what level of resistance do we see, is this going to damage the physical structure we're putting it on, does it sanitize and also deodorize, how affordable is it? And so really we fit into 3 different categories. High-level germicides that kill even endospores. These are things like sterilants, so they can literally create a sterile environment. Ultimately, these things are often dangerous and expensive and not something that the routine public can get. So these are usually used in medical situations. Intermediate levels are going to be things that kill most microbes, but not everything. And so the idea here is these are kind of the first level that a consumer could buy things at. And so they're used for usually things that don't have to be sterile, so things that are going to penetrate but not into what would be sterile tissue. Low level is typically going to be something that's more of a sanitizer, so you typically just kill vegetative bacteria, fungal cells, and some viruses. These are things that will usually come into contact with the body but not penetrate the body. So whenever we try to figure this out, we need to ask ourselves a few questions, like what are we trying to kill? What material are we killing the thing on? How much microbes are there? How long do we have? And naturally, what concentration of compound should we use? The other thing we need to ask is what method are we going to use to attack? Are we going to try to damage proteins, nucleic acids, cell walls, cell membranes? Again, if we're using something on a table, we don't have to be concerned about the cell wall of the table. But if we're using it on a person, that's probably not a good thing to use a protein targeting compound on a person that's made of proteins. So this is the point where, again, I'm not going to test you on the specifics of these compounds. I do expect you to know the difference between high, low, and intermediate, germicides, I expect you to kind of understand the questions of, what are we trying to kill and on what surface. So those are the things I care about. I don't care that you know specifically how each of these chemical compounds works. So I'm going to quickly go through these, just pointing out some important features. And again, this isn't really testable here, so don't stress too much on this last part of this chapter. So let's go through now, starting with halogens. Halogens are going to be microbiocide or even sporicides, and they're very commonly used. One of the things I want to point out is chlorine. Chlorine is going to be used a lot. Chlorine, including hypochlorites, which is bleach, are great at killing microbes and even endospores. And so the idea here is these things are usually fairly affordable and fairly effective. I do want to point out, though, that there are environmental factors that influence this, including light, the pH, or even the abundance of organic materials. Chlorine compounds, like hypochlorites, are used a lot in healthcare. In fact, bleach is probably one of the more commonly used things because it is cheap and also very effective. There's a reason we have you disinfect your tables with bleach. Iodine, like iodophores, is going to be used to kill or even cause a static situation. The idea here is these things don't typically have issues with organic material and pH, so would be more likely to be used on skin. But there are different forms of iodine, including aqueous iodine, which would be found in, again, water solution, tinctures, which would be alcohol and iodine tablets, which then can be put in water to disinfect the water, and then again, iodophores, which are complex of iodine and alcohols. Phenols are another effective method, but phenols can be toxic and have irritating side effects. Phenols are actually going to also have a very foul smell. So these things work at destroying vegetative bacteria, fungi, and most viruses, but again, often not something that's pleasant for people to interact with. So we see them as things like creosols, your triclosan. We'll talk a little bit about triclosan later and how it's become abundant in the environment. Alcohols, again, also work, but there is a level of effectiveness. Naturally, anything above 70% alcohol should be effective, and so anything above 140 proof should kill most vegetative bacteria, but not all endospores. So ethyl alcohols are great. 70 to 95% effectiveness, or 70 to 95% concentration is the most effective. Naturally, evaporation rates will affect how effective it is. If it evaporates before it kills everything, then you might have to reapply. Isopropyl, another thing that can be used, but again, less expensive, so something that's more readily available. These can affect the nervous system, though, due to the vapors produced, so never consume isopropyl. Hydrogen peroxides, as we discussed before, can be very effective. They are bactericidal, virucides, they're fungicides, even sporicides at high concentrations. But the idea, again, if we have something like catalase that can break it down, hydrogen peroxide no longer becomes an effective method. Hydrogen peroxide is readily used for sterilization, so vaporized hydrogen peroxide is a good way to sterilize. But again, these fumes can be very, very bad for you, so we want to keep you away from them. Same with ozone, which is O3. It's a similar feature, but again, this gas is very, very dangerous. Surfactants are going to also be effective. They're going to be great at disrupting the membrane and destroying the membrane. This includes things like detergents and soaps. Again, soaps are good at destroying the membrane and allowing for now a physical pathway in and out of the cell. Whenever you combine soaps with the scrubbing or mechanical action, they work pretty well. So you can see here the non-germicidal soaps versus the germicide soaps. The idea here is that, again, non-germicide soaps actually work incredibly well. So why would we have germicidal soaps? Because really all they do is push resistance. So there's been a big pushback against using antibacterial soaps, and more of the non-germicidal soaps should be used. Heavy metals are also going to be an effective method. Again, these things typically can be very toxic. I do want to point out that these are often toxic to us if ingested, so never ingest heavy metals like silver and such, because they will significantly disrupt the way your cells function and could potentially hurt you. So where do we use these things? Well, in lots of places. There's been a big push to use more heavy metals in typically things like your surgical equipment, tables, things like that. Even used for topical methods for like burn treatments. The idea here, again, silvers and really heavy metals can be introduced in a variety of compounds. Aldehydes are also effective. Glutaraldehyde, one of the more effective versions here. This is a sterilant, but it's also very dangerous, and so we've got to be very careful with it. Formaldehyde, again, very good at preventing the growth of microbes, but it is very toxic and very dangerous to work with. Glutaraldehyde, also again very effective. We often use it for sterilization, and then formalin tinctures can be used to disinfect surgical equipment. We also have our dangerous versions of gases, including ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide, very effective as a sterilizer, but very explosive and cancer-causing as well. As I said, ethylene oxide, very effective at being a sterilant, used for a lot of delicate surgical equipments and such. Propylene oxide is another version that's effective. It's much less dangerous and thus often used for sterilization of foods. So again, we have gas options that allow us to sterilize without damaging product. Dyes are also going to be capable of being antimicrobial, and so it's not uncommon to use dyes to really try to do antisepsis. And so the idea is different dyes or stains can actually prevent growth. Believe it or not, gram staining kills cells. Acids and alkalines, again, naturally extremes in pH, typically lethal to cells. And so whenever we change the pH, we can create damage to not just microbes, but even our cells potentially. I told you we'd talk a little more about triclosan. This is just more for your information, not really testable here. But one of the interesting things about triclosan is it's not readily broken down in the environment. And so this becomes something that becomes persistent in the environment. So we find it in people's urine, we find it in groundwater sources that now become drinking water. The idea is that literally triclosan stays around for long periods of time. It can be broken down, but it does pose a risk to the environment, including plants and animals. And so we're actually really trying to push away from triclosan because it's promoting resistance. But unfortunately, triclosan is used in lots of different places. So triclosan is used in things like Ajax and Dawn and Dial soaps. And so the idea here is we kind of need to get away from those things because those things are causing bigger problems than they're actually solving. Again, here's some more examples. Triclosan also found in Noxzema, Colgate toothpaste. Again, triclosan is commonly used, but is becoming a big complication for us.